Hello, and welcome to the LVP Architects podcast. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about the brief. So the things you need to know are they can be incredibly vague or incredibly detailed, and we're going to focus more the brief for the part 3, as these podcasts, this sort of season, as it were, is all focused about that. With regards to the brief for the part 3, there are 2 key moments where it's important. So the first one is a case study, which in the very first podcast we spoke about case studies and questions to ask. So that's the time when you investigate the brief and it's more historical. The second time it happens is in the exam. And it's usually, like a paragraph or 2 before the question. And as we mentioned in the previous podcast, with regards to the exam, there are 3 main sections. The beginning one is brief to planning. The middle one is construction phase. And the final questions are usually on handover. So the brief only occurs at the front end. Now, depending on what time of exam you have, some are multiple choice, some are take-home exams. But the brief is always in there somewhere. You'll get asked about doing a fee bid, resourcing, or to provide a procurement route for a specific type of project. When reading the first few paragraphs of the question, you need to interrogate the brief. So you've got to quite quickly scrub out the unimportant elements of the paragraphs, and you need to see what kind of depth the brief is giving you. So it could be very lightweight extension brief, or it could be very heavy duty new lab at a university brief. So what you need to delve into is things like stakeholders and how they could affect the project process. The site location, the planning process that would be needed for that. So is the site location in a conservation area? Is it extension or refurbishment to a listed building? The types of planning applications that you will need. These sort of things, you really need to know all the planning application options available. Like I just mentioned, how the planning process is affected by a conservation area or a listed building or a listed monument, as sometimes it's termed. You then need to think about the local plan and then the program and the feasibility assessment that they may mention it. So you've got to very quickly pick these sort of key points out. So usually they have a similar flow to them. They usually are the importance of the location, the client, the neighbours, and then they'll ask you about planning, application, and that's where you'll delve into what type you need. Any delays that could occur or any issues that could arise because of your neighbours or because of the site location. You've got to remember you haven't got a lot of time in your exam to answer these questions, so come up with some predetermined questions that you're going to ask yourself when reading the first few paragraphs of the question. That will go a long way to helping you start to set out your answer. So some things that you may need to consider are the client. You will need to assess the paragraphs and make assumptions. And when you're writing your exam answer, you should start off by stating your assumptions. So it could be things like the experience of the client, or the type of building they're trying to do and the current market, the finances they have, the type of building that they may be refurbishing or extending, its location. So is it a hotspot? Is it a conservation area? Listed, all that sort of stuff. And then you can narrow down what planning applications are suitable for this development. If you're relatively new to all of this or you haven't had much experience in planning, I'd recommend you go to the planning portal, where you can gain an awful lot of information for the different types of planning available, and it has some quite helpful guidance as well. As this is a discussion of brief related to the exam and case study, what you really need to look at as well with the brief is get a handle on what your services will be for this project, because that's going to help you sort of regarding your appointment and how you're going to propose to charge for the work. If it's a feasibility study, what are you going to charge? Are you going to charge a lump sum, a percentage of what? So, you have to take that into consideration when you're looking at a brief. How much time is this all going to take you? It's quite important at the beginning because the The brief, you have to try and extract an awful lot of information. And again, because it's 1-2 paragraphs at the beginning of a question, or if you're questioning your case study, or rather, you're questioning the information of the case study, the brief may not give all of that information that you need. This is where you're going to have to make assumptions, and you're going to have to state those. So your exam, or reading the case study as well, understand where your answers are coming from, so it all makes sense. In bringing this all together, because you don't have much time in the exam, you've sort of picked out these key points in those paragraphs, and now the questions are about producing a fee. So in producing a fee, you've now assessed the difficulty of the site, the type of client, and the neighbourhood, and possibly money. They may have said the kind of it may say rather the type of building, or it may say what type of client they are. So you need to assess those things, and then in your final fee, you're going to work out the complexity of doing all that work. In simple terms, how long a certain drawing will take you to do. So you kind of take that kind of approach. How long would it take you if you're recommending feasibility study? Because it might be a complicated site. How long do you think that would take you? How many meetings to get all the information back? How much research you need to do, and then producing the report. And then you can sort of work out not only your fee, but your program, and your fee are interlinked, And then that's beginning to form your answer of what you would recommend. It may be very straightforward, maybe simple. You might just say I recommend you go to this type of planning. It may be that you recommend an outline application because of the suitability of that to what they're asking. Maybe it's quite a new client or developer. It might be that area has none of those types of buildings, so you kind of want to feel out the likelihood of that with the planning officers early on. And then maybe it's about amassing, and that's what you're getting, so the outline is just about the scale of this thing. It's nothing further. We might recommend full planning and advise accordingly. So these are the sort of things that you need to consider. If it's touching on client, if it's a complicated client, or rather a multi-headed client, so there's quite a lot of stakeholders, then you need to take that into consideration with your fee and what you recommend, because it may be quite a few meetings. If you're going very in depth, you may need to include your costs, traveling costs, or are those included in you're just going to give those because you want this client. In being the first question, you're not going to be really in depth. You're trying to demonstrate that you understand what you need to consider in order for you to propose a fee. It's like if someone come up to you and say, how much will an extension cost? Well, you don't know. You'd have to do your research. You need to think about what's the scale of it. Do you need to hold the client's hand? Do you need to go to the planning officer quite a few times because it's going to be controversial? Does the client have the money? What they want, does that actually tie in with what their budget is? So when you're doing small scale stuff, you will think of these things, so your fee will reflect accordingly. And that's the same principle in a large project. You take that approach. So I think with that in mind, the next podcast will probably be talking about fee and program. So it's all interlinked again with the brief and the project timeline. See you then. Be clear.